Will there or will there not be a massive pre-buy ahead of EPA's 2027 ultra-low-NOx emissions rules? The 2027 rules demand much steeper cuts in NOx than we saw back in 2010, and the engine makers have only got 3 years to pull this off. The first new engines are scheduled to hit the street in calendar year 2026. And believe me, trucking remembers well the cost and the frustration associated with EPA's 2007 and 2010's rules and the damage they did to the heavy truck manufacturing sector. I'm Jim Park. My guest on this episode of HDT Talks Trucking is Tim Denoyer. He's a vice president and senior analyst at ACT Research. He thinks a pre-buy is inevitable. Before we get to Tim, give that subscribe button a whack and leave us a like if you enjoy HDT Talks Trucking. We'll be back with Tim Denoyer right after this. Welcome to another episode of HDT Talks Trucking. I'm equipment editor Jim Park. We're talking today with Tim Denoyer, a vice president and senior analyst at ACT Research. Tim and I are going to dig into a little bit about the pending pre-buy that might come our way thanks to the EPA's newest regulatory onslaught. Tim, welcome to HDT Talks Trucking. Good to have you aboard, sir.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
Last September, your colleague Kenny Veith spoke to my colleague Jack Roberts about a pending pre-buy. At the time, Kenny seemed to think it was imminent, but I'm just wondering, between September and now, since the rules have been published and folks have had a chance to read them, dig in a little bit, do you still think a pre-buy is imminent, at least to the extent that Kenny was talking?
Indeed, yeah. We think that there's definitely a very good chance. We think the rules that were published in December by the EPA would suggest we're very much in line with what we were thinking and really do confirm our suspicion, as much as we can have one at this point, that there will be a pre-buy ahead of these 2027 rules, the heavy-duty low-NOx rules in particular.
Well, you've got the low-NOx rule coming out from EPA, then you've got GHG rules piling on top of that, and then you've got CARB's omnibus clean truck rule. So
yeah,
it's 3 significant rules coming all at the same time. I'd be pretty nervous about buying a truck that went through all that in a couple of years period.
Yeah, and California is planning on going ahead with the low-NOx regulations for 2024. As we understand it at this point, there is still some question marks, I think, in the industry about if that's going to, how that's going to happen and how that's going to go. But I think there could be some pre-buying in California this year as they prepare for this. So we do think that that's to the extent that it's imminent. It would be California and any states that are going to follow very soon after, and some of those will have staggered rollouts. In 2025 and so some of the pre-buying may take some time, but the national pre-buy that we're expecting is really likely to pick up in 2025, sort of middle of the year, and go through 2026 ahead of the 2027 standards. That's the real big one.
Well, I've heard one maintenance consultant, we spoke about this a while back, he's predicting a no-buy. Is it likely to get that bad, do you think?
Well, you can refer back to Newton's third law of motion. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And so when we have pre-buys, there's typically a low buy thereafter. And so the economy only needs so many trucks. So if we flood the market in one year, typically that will pay back in subsequent years. To go back to a moment ago, I didn't really mention the GHG standards, which you're right about, and to kind of talk about why we pre-buy. We've had a few steps of GHG standards over the past decade, which have not had any sort of pre-buying around them, which makes perfect sense, right? The fuel economy.
You get fuel economy back. Yeah, there's advantages to that.
Well worth the small increase in the upfront price of a new truck.
Yeah,
and we will have a step up in the GHG standards in 2027. So there will be a fuel economy improvement happening at that time. But the cost and complexity increases of the low-NOx standards, we think, are going to sort of overwhelm that. And so even with those GHG regulations still coming, we don't think that's going to be enough to sort of forestall a pre-buy.
Okay. Uh, I've heard numbers anywhere from 20 to EMA predicted at one point $35,000 increase on the cost of a truck. Do you folks have any handle on how much of an increase we might actually be looking at?
Yeah, I think we did some of those studies for EMA.
Okay. All
And
right.
we certainly participated in a lot of that work. And I think, the more recent thinking, because the EPA has pared things back, there was a good Ricardo study that was published about a little over a year ago at this point, but they've done some really good work on this. I think everyone's settling out more in the $20,000 to $25,000 range on a national level.
Mm-hmm.
I think you could see higher cost increases in California in particular. Next year, it could be a bigger numbers because, we take these, research costs and amortize it over a small budget, like, small number of trucks like they sell in California. It's not, not a tiny number, but it's not a national number.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's a lot, harder to for the manufacturers to do on a single state basis. So it really gets a little messy at that point. So, but I think $20,000 to $25,000 is overall roughly the cost increase we're expecting nationally for 2027. About five of that is just component costs. There's going to be some re-engineering where the SCR system will be close coupled to the engine. We're going to add cylinder deactivation. We'll have some more complex SCR systems, dual dosing SCR systems, which will essentially treat the emissions twice on the way out. That actually has an operating cost disadvantage for truckers because the DEF consumption is going to go up probably quite a bit, by roughly double. And so that's going to cost more just to operate the truck. And so that's going to, eat into some of those GHG savings, for example. They'll also be adding cylinder deactivation technology to the engines. But that's not the biggest piece of the price increase. The biggest piece of the price increase is actually the increased useful life and warranty provisions in the regulations, which that is a benefit for the fleets. The purchasers are going to have the benefit of a long warranty on the emission systems, but that's going to go into the upfront price of the truck.
Yeah, the engine makers are going to have to make these things nearly bulletproof to keep them on the road for that long.
There's a lot being put on the much significantly longer useful life requirements and warranty. And I think because I chuckle, and you're right that's what it's reading the regulations would sort of suggest. In the real world, I think there's going to be more replacements of emission systems, and that does happen in the market today to some extent.
Yeah. Okay. Sounds like a vague question, I guess, but what is it that causes a pre-buy? Is it fleets just wanting to avoid the expense or the uncertainty, or bring some predictability to their business for a few more years? What's the thinking on that?
Yeah, so these trucking companies are their job is to be as competitive as possible and plan fleets for the long term. And there will be typically fleets don't like to pre-buy, and they like to have a more consistent fleet management process. But when these two sort of factors of willingness and ability to pre-buy align, it really can be big. And to start with, the ability, certainly it has to be a good market. So we think that this coming 2027 regulation is sort of most analogous to EPA 07 and EPA 2010. EPA 2010, there wasn't a pre-buy though, because we were coming out of a recession and there wasn't an ability to buy because the industry had been through such a rough couple of years, and we were still in a fairly loose market. And so industry conditions matter, but willingness is the most important. Why do they want to? And it is really to avoid that additional cost and complexity. And with a $20,000 plus price increase in 2027, those 2026 trucks are just going to be more competitive in the market for a while. And so there's going to be that low buy effect in early 2027 that there's going to be temporary, but some avoidance of the new technology is just sort of
Mhm.
natural.
Where does that leave the truck and engine makers if they've, going triple shifts to build enough trucks, uh, keep the assembly lines awfully busy, but then you've got the engineering side who's trying at the same time to build out these new and technically complex emission systems while simultaneously pouring money into R&D for zero emissions vehicles. That's
Yeah,
got to put a lot of stress on the old bottom line there. Cash flow.
absolutely. It's putting a lot of pressure on the manufacturers, broadly speaking. I think you're seeing more of what Daimler and Cummins are doing together, where Daimler is essentially giving Cummins more responsibility for its diesel engineering, and I think everyone's really working hard on the zero emissions side. But it is constraining the resources and causing a little bit more outsourcing is one thing we've seen.
For sure. We've already seen a couple of smaller truck manufacturers give up making their own engines and haul Cummins in to replace them. I don't think Daimler's going to walk away anytime soon, but do you see any more of that happening in the market?
I mean, longer term, that there's a bit of a disincentive on some of the incumbent OEMs to continue to invest in some of these incumbent technologies,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a big challenge for the long term. I think they'll all be able to meet these low NOx regulations, and um, I don't see any major shifts. I think it's unlikely to cause as many shifts as the EPA '07 and EPA 2010 standards did. At this point, it's hard to see
Yeah.
anything like those big engine share changes back then.
Well, I guess ultimately some good's going to come from all this cleaner engines, cleaner air. Everybody's going to be happy with that, but it's going to be a pretty rocky road getting there. How do you see all this unfolding? Can you give me a 5-year outlook on this?
From a trucking industry perspective, there's certainly the negatives from a pre-buy perspective. I think bigger picture, the biggest concern I have for the trucking industry is adding a lot of capacity in a pre-buy is just inherently bad for rates and
Yeah.
hurts truckers' profitability. Now, at the same time, that's a probably a 1 year comment. We'll have probably a rough down cycle in 26, 27 as the industry digests this pre-buy. But over the longer term, if we think from a 5 or 10 year perspective, I think the higher cost base of the industry and the increased complexity that's going on is going to actually help pricing power for fleets and help them to raise rates. And ultimately, I think it's going to be a positive. But there's certainly going to be some short term pain kind of centered around 2027.
Well, some commentators are saying planning ahead for all this is key. Do you have any advice for fleets on how to navigate, especially smaller ones? I mean, the big guys have VPs of challenges like this; they can sort it out. But the 20 truck fleet that's based in Branson, Missouri, how do they navigate this? Any suggestions for them?
Yeah, I think for the small fleets, I think be smart about a lot of those fleets are buying used equipment, and a lot of them will do really well just operating on sort of secondhand equipment for long periods of time, and I
Hmm.
think that's going to be a pretty good strategy, and just being smart about what you buy, and it's always there's always some risks around those first ones off of the production line with the new standard, and that is what I think the industry is going to try to avoid, and but at the same time, I think all of this is generally going to be positive for the used truck values, and we don't typically see a lot of the emissions components, translate. Those values don't translate well into the used truck market,
Hmm.
but things like warranties and longer useful lives of components, I think they should. So I think ultimately this is not too bad for the industry. I think the industry will survive and probably come out a bit stronger.
Well, the people in the secondary market have got to be rubbing their hands together. This has got to be a boon for their business.
Yeah. The cylinder deactivation, as far as I know, is not really million-mile ready. I mean, as far as I've never heard of cylinder deactivation lasting that long. So that'll be interesting.
I've driven it. Jacobs has had me out in the test track a few times, and it works, from
Oh, definitely.
small scale stuff.
Yeah.
So, like you say, 1,000,000 miles. I don't know how long. That's a different story. Any final words for us on this, before I let you go?
No, I think you asked the right questions, and I definitely appreciate you having me.
Well, Tim, thanks a lot. Appreciate it. We've been talking with Tim Denoyer, a Vice President and Senior Analyst at ACT. This is HDT Talks Trucking. I'm Jim Park. We'll catch you next time. Don't forget to subscribe to Heavy Duty Trucking's YouTube channel and give us a like. That helps other people to find us. Check out our other social media channels as well. We're on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. And remember, there's lots of great written content about the trucking industry on our website, truckinginfo.com. I'm Jim Park. Thanks for watching.